This is Father Bonaventure Chapman.
And this is Father Patrick Briscoe.
And welcome to Godsplaining. Thanks to all those who support us. If you enjoy the show, please consider making a monthly donation on Patreon. Be sure to like and subscribe to Godsplaining wherever you listen to your podcasts. This is a Guestsplaining episode, and we are very delighted to welcome Professor Francis Beckwith. Professor Beckwith, welcome.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Okay, well, I know you're going to do a little introduction as well, or you'll be able to fill this in. But for those of you who don't know you, you are prolific, I have to say. Lots of books and lots of articles, but Dr. Beckwith is the professor of philosophy and church state studies at Baylor University, where he serves the associate director of the graduate program in philosophy and resident scholar in Baylor's Institute for Studies of Religion. You have many books published, including your convert, of course, to Catholicism. And you also have a book, one of these, there's a ton of these things that you can mention, whichever, but the one might be interesting to our listeners as well, other than the one we're going to talk about, is one in 2019 called Never Doubt Thomas, the Catholic Aquinas as Evangelical and Protestant. That's always great to hear. And the book we're talking about in one of your more recent books, the one we're talking about here from Ignatius Press, is A Catholic Engagement with Latter-day Saints. And this is something, an edited collection, which you did with Richard Sherlock. So welcome. And we're excited to talk about this book project about Latter-day Saints or Mormonism and anything else that comes up here.
Great. Well, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Professor Beckwith, first off, I suppose, you were just sitting one day and you thought, you know what? Let's do Mormonism. How did this talk about why Mormonism, why discuss this, why have this particular topic with these particular people, and what you hope for with this book?
Yeah, so there's a kind of personal and professional history that goes into the book. So I grew up in Southern Nevada. I grew up in Las Vegas, Nevada, and I actually left the Catholic Church as a kid, as a teenager, and then, as you mentioned, I returned back in 2007. But while I was growing up in Nevada, and then eventually when I went on to study philosophy, I actually became fascinated with Latter-day Saints. Why Nevada? Well, Nevada is one of the states that is part of what is sometimes called the I-15 corridor that goes from Salt Lake City to Los Angeles. And so there were a lot of people who I grew up with who were Latter-day Saints, and I was always fascinated by their theology, their beliefs. I was never tempted to become a Latter-day Saint, but I just thought it was so interesting how different the different views they held about God and Christ and Scripture, even though they used much of the same language as sort of more conventional Nicene Christians accept. Now, when I was at Fordham, I actually wanted to do my doctoral dissertation on the Mormon concept of God, and I was rightly discouraged from doing it, not because it wasn't an interesting topic. My professors thought it was really interesting, but they thought it would not be the best way for me to enter the job market. So after I was done with the dissertation, which was actually on David Hume's argument against miracles, I co-authored a small book with a gentleman named Steve Parrish, a evangelical philosopher at Concordia University, and it's called The Mormon Concept of God. That was published about 30 years ago. Okay. And so I sort of never lost that interest. And then in the late 90s, I was approached by two graduate students at Biola University. Biola is an evangelical school, and two students at their seminary, both of whom eventually went on to get doctorates and become professors themselves in New Testament. They had come across that early 1990s book, and they said, you and Steve Parrish about the only two evangelicals that we know of that, even though you're critical of Mormonism, you don't engage in rhetorical flourishes, you treat them seriously, and we kind of want to continue what you guys are doing and draw more scholars into the conversation. So we published in 2002 a book called The New Mormon Challenge, which was mostly a collection of essays. Actually, all the contributors are evangelicals. We deal with issues about the Book of Mormon, whether Mormons are Christians. Not many, although virtually all the book would be received. All of the chapters would be received favorably by Catholics. We were actually intentionally trying to cast a kind of wide net in the among what we call Nicene Christians.
Yeah, yeah.
And in fact, we invited two Catholic theologians to contribute to the book, and they declined
Aha.
because they were too busy. So,
Kath, sounds fair.
so several years later, I eventually returned to the Catholic Church, and I get an email from Professor Richard Sherlock at Utah State University, who I've known since the late 90s. And Richard, who was Latter-day Saint, said, I converted to Catholicism, and let's put together a book like you guys did with the New Mormon Challenge. And so that's the story.
Great.
You've mentioned a couple times, Professor, this categorization, and some of our listeners, I'm sure, are right there with you, but others might be a little unsure exactly of what it means, because you made a big distinction where you were talking about Catholics as Nicene Christians and suggesting that Mormons were not Nicene Christians. Could you say just a little bit about what that means and how that's a pretty fundamental claim? I mean, it's a neat little sentence, right? It's very tight, but that's a big idea there that I'm sure many Catholics are not aware of.
Yeah, so at the Council of Nicaea, there were several issues that were resolved in the church, having to do with the nature of Christ and his relationship to the Father. And there, the council uses, I think, the important and rich language of Greek philosophy to help explain what it means, as we say every Sunday, the Son is consubstantial with the Father. And as Nicene Christians, we accept that. We accept the oneness of God, but at the same time, the Son is eternally begotten of the Father. And eventually, the Holy Spirit's role is also dealt with, not as detailed for obvious reasons because of the dispute between Arius and Athanasius. But so where Mormons depart from that is they just simply deny that the members of the Trinity are of one substance. They also hold that God is not outside of time, that he is a physical being, and that the unity of God is not a unity of substance, but just a unity of purpose. So it's a radically different view of God. Now, there's a scholar who's now since passed away, Steve Webb, who was for years a professor at Wabash College in Indiana. He was a convert to Catholicism, and one of his last works was on what he called Mormon Christianity. And he's the one who actually really, I think he's right by saying that, I don't know if he's right about this, but this is his view. He thinks that Mormonism is what Christianity would have turned out if it had not employed the resources of Greek philosophy to account for God's triunity. I'm not too sure about that. I mean, Steve and I had our disagreements. He was a good friend. I think he was a little bit too sympathetic to Mormonism as a Catholic, but he was a very, very bright guy. And I actually wrote an endorsement for the book. But so that's where I kind of got the idea from Steve that to distinguish Mormons from Nicene Christians.
And if I could just jump in there with a follow-up, because these debates circle around from time to time in various ways, right? Like there have been big discussions in various Catholic and evangelical circles about whether or not Catholics and Muslims worship the same God, for example. So these are this is a related, a kind of allied question, and so I want to put that question to you, Professor. Is it fair to say that Catholics and Mormons worship the same God, or do you think that these fundamental disagreements mean that we've got different categories at work here?
Yeah. So the short and quick answer is no, I don't believe they worship the same God. Whereas I do think that Muslims and Christians worship the same God. Yeah. And I think it's because they both have the same understanding of what constitutes a divine nature philosophically, whereas the Mormons completely reject that. So in terms of sort of doctrinally, not the same God. But having said that, do I believe that each and every individual Mormon doesn't worship the same God? I don't know that.
Right.
It's like with anything concerning theology or doctrine. I don't want to say that uh, in order to properly worship God, you have to be able to fully articulate the Nicene Creed and know exactly what each element means in its deep history. I just think that's, and this is why,
The sticky wicket. Yeah.
yeah. So you think about like, Aquinas does talk about that, right? That one can have implicit faith. I think that's the way he puts it. You guys are the Dominicans, so
Yeah, the
so
conceptual target, the
yeah,
conceptual. I mean, obviously, you love what you know in a sense that you need to have some targeting for worship, particularly. But the fine grainedness of that need not be. Uh, yeah, you don't have to have the knowledge of a theologian to worship the
yeah,
true God. And in fact, he has this beautiful line in the Apostles, his reflections, of the Apostles' Creed, where he talks about how the faith of a washerwoman, Utila, is as powerful and more powerful as some of the
yeah,
theologians because of the assent of belief, even though her cognitive capacities and resources are not up to the theologians, because
yeah,
faith has a sort of also fiduciary trusting capacity to it. So I think we do want to
yeah.
hold. You don't want to have. Yeah, you don't want to have. It's like, I mean, well, the Eucharist too, which I want to talk about because you have a chapter on the Eucharist in here, and I couldn't imagine what the Mormons would have to do with the Eucharist, but I'm excited about that. But like, I mean, when they did this study, the Eucharistic doctrine, transubstantiation, is a powerful metaphysical thesis that explained the real presence of Christ. But do you need to understand scholastic metaphysics of substance, actions, relationship, and concomitants on the dimensive quantity? No. You need to believe that's Jesus and not bread anymore.
Yeah.
And
Well, that's
so,
why
yeah,
the church accepts the sacraments of those Eastern Rite churches that never really have had an
yeah,
elaborate, transubstantiation
yeah.
view. At least the Aristotelian version.
Yeah, and it would be strange. I mean, it's not. Yeah, until until Aristotle comes out, you can't even have transubstantiation qua that.
Yeah.
Okay, but let's not do that. Let's do the question of. So Mormonism, as far as I can tell, is they're really great people. I remember reading early on a book called The Natural Family, a Manifesto, which was co-written by Alan Carlson and Paul
Ah,
T. Marrow. And I was in college, and I just thought this was just fantastic. It was this kind of beautiful kind of discussion about big families and traditional models and this kind of stuff, third wayism, as you might say. And so that always struck me as being right, that Mormons and Catholics like have some of the same moral structures and practices. We're big family people. We care about this kind of stuff. We're allied in these things, and it's the beliefs that like are very different. And it's a shame that like you'd think, well, shoot, do beliefs not matter to practice? But I want to know about beliefs. Like, what surprised you as you've read a lot about Mormonism and talked with Mormons and such, what misconceptions or surprises, what was your biggest surprise? Like, oh, I thought they believed this, which sounded crazy, but actually, I don't agree with them, maybe, or I don't, but
yeah,
like, but it's not as crazy as it sounds, and this isn't, this kind of thing. So
yeah.
what maybe a misconception or two that Catholics might have, or you might have had about them?
Well, I think I've over the years I think becoming Catholic or returning to the Catholic Church has made me more sensitive to a tradition having variety of sources. This is something I didn't really have as an evangelical. I thought I
Yeah.
was very much a sola scripturist. And so I would read Mormons or Mormon literature with an eye to sort of catching them to believe the wrong thing
Mm-hmm.
rather than being open to the possibility that their own theology has changed over time as a result of not nefarious reasons. They
Mm-hmm.
just simply begin to maybe more better understand their own theology. And I think I learned a lot of that from reading Latter-day Saints theologians, and there aren't many of them. Most Latter-day Saints are
Right.
very well educated in general, but in terms of the humanities or the classics or philosophy, theology, not so much. But
Yeah.
they do have some very well educated, very bright theologians, some of whom are friends of mine. And one of the things that I've noticed in their own journeys is that they'll go off to, let's say, a Princeton or a Harvard or Florida or Texas for a PhD in philosophy or religious studies or theology, and then realized that Mormonism is sort of outside of the sort of regular Christian traditions, and they will actually like some of the regular, more ordinary Christian writers and thinkers, both Protestant and Catholics, and try to appropriate that, and then go back and read their own writers and find something in them that they may have not seen before. And so one of the things that I think that this, at least my contribution to the chapters that I wrote for the book, as well as the introduction that I co-authored with Richard, is that I wanted to always read the Mormons with the principle of charity. And that's something I think, and it's made me better understand how the Latter-day Saints will sometimes interpret their own presidents and prophets in ways that, let's say, their predecessors didn't. So to give you an example, Joseph Smith Jr., the founder of Mormonism, says, he tells the story of how God became God. He said God lived on his own planet, was immortal like us, and then eventually evolved to godhood. And that sounds like, if you just read that, it sounds as though that there's a time where God was not God. And yet, if you read the Book of Mormon, which was the first of the books that are added to the canon, there's nothing in the Book of Mormon that doesn't sound like classical theism, that God has always been God. And so what you find is some Mormon scholars saying, look, there's a way to read Joseph Smith where it doesn't sound like he's saying that, a human being became God. Well, we believe God was in some ways like us, and we share his nature, but we don't have to accept necessarily the view that he was at some time never God or not God. So now I'm not,
Sure.
So what I've done, and this is where my writing has changed on Mormonism, is that in my chapter the chapter I primarily authored is the one where I respond to the great Mormon writer B.H. Roberts, who had debated a Jesuit priest in the early 20th century and had the last word. And so my chapter is called The Long-Awaited Reply to B.H. Roberts. And so one of the things I try to do in the chapter is whenever there's a disputed Mormon doctrine among scholars, I say that, and I don't want to saddle with them with a view that they could get out of reasonably.
Yeah, that's fair.
Well, I wanted to ask a little bit of a follow-up there, because Father Bonaventure kind of prompted with the moral tradition. Do you think that is the best place to begin building this common ground? You talk about how important the principle of charity is, and I completely agree. We want to in a serious conversation, we want to take learned individuals as learned individuals, right? And is the moral life really, though, the best place for beginning to build that bridge? I think instinctively that's where many Catholics would begin. Or are there other places where you see stronger resonance between our two traditions?
Yeah, I think that, in fact, in the first book I edited back in 2002, the New Mormon Challenge, my chapter makes that very argument that I begin with those moral questions that Mormons and traditional Christians hold in common, and talk about how we can be co-belligerents and work together. And then I move from that to the question, can the Mormon view of God sustain the moral views that they hold? In other words, if God is God the source of morality, and if he isn't, then you have a kind of Euthyphro dilemma within Mormonism, or you have morality without a source that is a mind. Right. So I actually use that as my way to sort of dialogue with the Mormons. And that's one way. I think another, especially with Catholics, and here it would be moral, but it would be more focused on Catholic social thought. So when I wrote that chapter in 2002, in the first book, I was an evangelical, and I was mostly interested in issues concerning culture and what the Bible teaches on certain moral questions. Now, after I returned to the church, I gave a talk to the LDS Public Affairs Office in 2011 on Catholic social thought. And that's why I bring it up. And they just were absolutely into it. I mean, as I presented it, and I talked about how Catholic social thought, as we know it today, really arises with Leo and Rerum Novarum, and how the church is really responding to this modern view of the self, and so you really can't say it's left or right. And I explained the anthropology behind it, and the most fascinating thing that occurred, at least the first thing it blew my mind, is the first 4 or 5 questions were all about when does a pope decide to write an encyclical kind of question. They were sort of these kind of bureaucratic ecclesial questions, and they weren't about like, oh, can the church defend these views as correct? Because it was pretty clear from my audience they all agreed with virtually everything the church had taught. And that made me think about Latter-day Saints, even though we tend to, at least I tend to think of them as a kind of Islam. I think of them as sort of the Islam of Protestantism, if there could be such a thing. But they also, because of their hierarchical structure, they are sometimes really more interested in these kind of internal church questions. And so that's another place where we can meet the Mormons as well.
Bureaucracy.
Yeah.
Great. That's the best meeting place in the world. Professor Beckwith, I want to ask about, you reflect on that some people have said that Mormonism is the most American of religions. Like, it is a fundamentally American religion. Like Catholicism is a French religion or something. I don't know. Protestantism is like a German or a Huguenot religion, but that Mormonism is like something quintessentially American about it. What do you make of that? And I mean, how? Yeah, is there something to that?
I think there is. I don't know who said it, but I remember reading years ago somebody saying that Mormonism does what nobody thought was possible, merging 19th century progressive confidence in human nature with biblical literalism, which is a
that's America. That's totally America. Hoover
right?
Dam and the Scopes Monkey trial. Yeah,
that's right. Or Chris, like the secular version of it is, I think Alan Bloom called it nihilism with a happy face.
Yeah, that's good.
It's whereas the religious version, I mean, it's really interesting that within Mormonism you have a very positive, confident view in human nature. It's when I mentioned earlier when I spoke in Salt Lake City to the LDS Public Affairs Office, I also gave a couple of talks at BYU, and there was a young man, doctoral student from Indiana University. I think Father Patrick said, which one of you is from Indiana? Father?
Oh yeah,
Father
that's
Patrick.
me. From Indiana.
So,
Go Hoosiers.
So this young man was a doctoral student in I think political science, and he was doing his doctoral work in church and state issues, and he literally flew out to Provo to be my ride because he was interested in my work on church and state, and he had gone to BYU as an undergraduate, and he gave me a kind of tour of Provo, and went to a couple of Mormon wards, and then something I never noticed before. I asked him, I said, why is it that every painting of Jesus that I see, he doesn't have any scars?
Oh, interesting.
And he doesn't have any in his hand.
Yeah.
And he said, wow, I'd never thought about that before. And so it's interesting for a religion that is so physicalist in terms of its view of God and the world. It's very materialistic. It doesn't believe in that in immaterial
Yeah.
realities,
Yeah.
that it would be so, at least aesthetically, devoid of the physical marks of suffering.
Yeah.
And I don't know the answer to it. It's just a
Sure, that's
sort
it.
of,
But it's intentional, though, that they miss out the marks,
yeah,
right? Oh, interesting. That's
yeah.
fascinating.
And so it was great. And then he took me to the cathedral in Salt Lake City, which is Catholic cathedral, which is beautiful.
Yeah.
And it was, when I walked up to the front to pray, I noticed on the top right,
Oh, yeah.
there's this big green patch, and there's words inscribed. It says, I think it's from Galatians, where Paul says,
It is.
even if I or an angel
Yeah.
from heaven were to preach another
The
gospel.
gospel.
And I thought, wow, that clear. And I looked at the history. Actually, it was I think the first Catholic bishop of Utah, when they were designing the chapel,
Yes.
had that put.
That's
put
bold.
up there.
I love
So,
that.
yeah.
That's bold.
Yeah. As
Professor
the kids
Beckwith.
would say today, based.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Professor Beckwith. I want Father Patrick has a particular question at the end. I want him to end on.
Sure.
But I want to ask you, just following on this ritual business. Just because I mentioned it, you have a chapter in there on the Eucharist and realism and such. I mean, what in the world do Mormons care about Eucharistic realism?
Yeah, so we also have a chapter on the liturgy by Rachel Liu, who's a
Sure.
convert. So her chapter is kind of complementary with ours.
Okay.
She talks about, and something that I didn't really appreciate, is that every Latter-day Saint Sunday service has distribution of communion. They call it the sacrament.
Okay.
But their view of the Eucharist is very much low church Protestant. So they would be, Zwinglian, I guess.
Yeah, symbolic,
Yeah,
basically.
very symbolic view. So what we do in that chapter is kind of situate the Mormon view with Protestantism in terms of, where it fits. And then it just explain the Catholic view, both historically and philosophically. And in that chapter was co-authored with my brilliant colleague Alexander Preuss, who is not a scholar of Mormonism, but he is one of the great Catholic metaphysicians alive today. And so I kind of brought him up to speed with Mormonism, and he was able to contribute the section of the chapter where he talks about quantum physics. And I'm not sure I even understand that portion of the chapter that I co-authored.
Can't believe in real presence if you don't understand quantum physics.
So he gives all these sort of analogies, and so Alex it's wonderful that he
he's great.
Agreed to do
he's
it
really
with
great.
me, so
he's a man who can come up with, in a philosophical conference, he can always come up with a counterexample immediately. You make a position, it's like, well, but what if we think about the number of left-handed termites in my room? It's just he can come up with this, kind of defeat or counterexample to any sort of proposition. It's a classic analytic philosophy move.
Alex will sometimes knock on my door and he'll say, Frank, I have a question. He did this a couple of times, and then I went to his blog and he would say, I just went to Beckwith's office and we had this, and it's amazing. But very bright guy, always thinking.
Yeah, fantastic.
Well, my last question, because I did want to get a question about liturgy in there, so I'm very glad you followed up on that one, Father Bonaventure. But my last question, Professor, that I want to ask about, because I genuinely, I don't know what the understanding is. What do the last days look like according to Mormonism, and what is the eventual? I do know a little bit about the eventual promise for eternity, but I think the last days, the end times, the ultimate our ultimate end. That's a great place to kind of round up our discussion so far.
Yeah, so the Latter-day Saints have a kind of 4-tier afterlife. They're the highest form of salvation, if you want to call it that, is for a Mormon male to become a god of his own world and to procreate children with his wife. It's
okay.
And then there is a realm of heaven for those that that were not married in the temple, who did not go through that, but they just don't get to benefit from sort of eternal marriage. And then there are those probably people like us who are we're not Mormons, but we're not necessarily anti-Mormon. So there's a place for us, and then very few people make it to hell in LDS.
That's super optimistic. All right.
Yeah. So,
It feels
but
American.
yeah. So
yeah, super American. Yeah. So do I? But so do we? We don't get planets, huh? We're living on other people's planets.
No.
Yeah. Okay, but the second ring doesn't get planets either, though, right? The second level, it's only the top planet.
That's right.
Okay, well, that makes you feel a little better. All right, that's fine. Professor Beckwith, I mean, it's Mormonism is fascinating because it is this American kind of religion, and I mean, what if you were to leave Catholics with something? What ought we to know about, or what's something we should think about with Mormonism? Like what? So kind of the so what point. Like what do we have to do with them?
I think there's things we can learn from the Latter-day Saints. I think that even though their theology is mistaken, I do think that there is an element of grace that they've received for whatever minimal faith they have. And they have, in many ways, exploited it far beyond their theology should have let them. If I could say such a thing. Yeah. And I have great admiration for them. They I think of all religious groups in the U.S., they clearly suffered the most persecution, even more so than Catholics. I mean, for different reasons. The practice of polygamy drew the attention of the federal government, which came very close to confiscating all their property and assets. So what they've built in the Great Salt Lake Basin is extraordinary. I don't know if you ever have an opportunity to go to Brigham Young University and visit, you should.
Beautiful, yeah.
It's I had a wonderful time there. The thing that I noticed, and this was 14 years ago, so I don't know if it's still the case, that most or a large segment of the students were married with children.
Yeah.
Which was really, really extraordinary. I saw undergraduates walking with baby carriages on campus. And I think that's something Catholics may want to think about, that, that we shouldn't emulate the world's understanding of putting off marriage for career, which is, I think my own view, is not such a great idea. But interesting how their emphasis on family, the charity that they have exhibited within their community, I think there's a lot of things we can learn from them.
Yeah, no, I think and the sort of moral earnestness and the seriousness they take with in terms of the natural goods of the family that we Catholics sometimes don't take as seriously. So yeah, that's great. Well, Professor Beckwith, thank you for discussing this. The book we're talking about here is an edited collection called Catholic Engagement with Latter-day Saints. You can get it from Ignatius Press. And to look up we didn't talk about a bunch of the chapters, of course, but all the things there. And just to delve into America's strangest religion, perhaps, but most unique one. And Professor Beckwith, where else? Obviously, people can just Google your name and they're going to find, I promise you, tons of things. But is there a website or any other, or are you an X, or do you have your own kind of website or thing that you like to keep up to date with, things that people could find out more about you? Because you, again, prolific, more than just Mormons.
Yeah, so I have a website, francisbeckwith.com. I am on X, although it's a long story, but before Elon Musk took it over, I lost my account. So
my gosh, fantastic.
Over.
Well done.
I remember that.
It was,
I followed it from afar.
It was something so minor. I made a joke that was picked up by Fox News, and the joke was about a political person, and within 24 hours my account vanished.
Oh my gosh.
And I only had like 7,000 followers,
sure.
But Fox and Friends had this on the screen. I had no idea this happened until after class, one of my high school buddies called me. He says, "My God, you just made Fox News."
Yeah.
And your joke. And so to make a long story short, it was gone. And so I had to start over.
Oh my gosh.
So,
fantastic. You might be the first person that we've had on here that's banned. I'm not sure. There might be others. It is Godsplaining after all. But
Yeah.
Professor Beckwith, thank you so much for joining us for the conversation.
Thanks for having me.
And now I turn to all you. Thanks again to all our supporters. If you'd like to donate to our work, check us out at patreon.com/Godsplaining. Follow us on Facebook, X, Instagram. Like, subscribe, leave a 5-star review if you deem it so worthy. Visit Godsplaining.org to shop merchandise and get dates information for upcoming Godsplaining events, for retreats, days of recollection, and things in the summer. And any other notes. Also check down here in the news and notes for things from Professor Beckwith. We'll link those things as well. But know of our prayers for you, and please pray for us. We'll catch you next time on Godsplaining.